I'm Scott Carrell. I'm an associate professor of economics at the University of California, Davis, and my work primarily focuses on education, higher education, peer effects, and teacher quality.
Thanks so much for being here. Now, you've actually had a different path than most, attending the U.S. Air Force Academy prior to earning your PhD. How did you choose that path? Did you always know you were going to go the PhD route?
No, in fact, my experience motivates a lot of my research because I think random occurrences and interactions with different people really can affect your lifelong outcomes. I ended up as an economist by accident, primarily through the Air Force, forcing me to get a degree in economics, and then meeting my eventual advisor in graduate school, David Figlio, who motivated me and got me interested in education research.
Now, you've written, as you mentioned, you've written extensively about teacher and peer effects in college, and even recently had the opportunity to try to improve peer composition by changing the structure of squadron makeup. Can you describe this work and where you think we need to go next? What are the lessons learned?
So I started this research because I was interested in peer effects generally, and I saw the Air Force Academy as an interesting opportunity to study social interactions in a very controlled environment. And after I did that initial work and found some interesting findings, I said, well, this is gee whiz. We find these effects, but unless you do something with the findings, does it really matter? And so my co-author, Jim Westenike and Bruce Sacerdote, convinced the Air Force to let us, for lack of a better word, social engineer incoming cohorts of freshmen with the objective function of raising the grades for the lowest ability students in the cohort. And we went through this process, and at the end of the day, we found opposite effects of what we expected. The students we wanted to help, we actually ended up finding negative effects on their achievement. And the story is long, but what we found is when you manipulate peer groups and you do it in an extreme way, that there's endogenous sorting within those groups, and they didn't interact with whom we thought they would. And in fact, they socially isolated themselves, and that's what drove these negative effects. I think what we can say to this date is that peers truly do matter, but the story of how they matter is very complex, and we have a lot more to learn.
So today you're presenting about a series of work you've undertaken on how domestic violence leads to spillover effects in the classroom. Can you talk about how you began this work and your findings and any implications it has for practice?
Yeah, clearly no research idea is created in a vacuum, and so my graduate student classmate Mark Hoekstra and I were having a conversation, and several years prior he had collected divorce records, and while he was collecting the divorce records, also was able to obtain domestic violence records, and then we were able to match those domestic violence records to children's school records. And when we first wrote this paper, at that point, there weren't a lot of good, what I would call exogenous proxies for peer quality. If we look at test scores, those can be influenced by the peers you're currently going to school with or you've gone to in the past. And so we made what I thought was a reasonable assumption that a kid who is linked to a restraining order in their household, that's not going to be caused by their classmates in school. And so we could use this along with some other econometric techniques to causally identify the role of peers in the classroom. And so that's, again, what motivated us. We found these negative spillovers, and then we said, well, how can we understand these more, and what are the policy implications of these findings? And so that's what I'll be presenting today in my talk.
And you did have one really positive finding in your previous paper from 2012, that when these were reported, you saw a significant change.
Yeah, we were fortunate when we collected the data. We had the exact date in the record of when the mother filed the restraining order, and so we were able to identify kids who, what we call it, unreported domestic violence in the sample. That is, we knew at some point in the future their mother was going to file a restraining order, versus kids who had previously been linked to domestic violence. That is, when they took their test and they were interacting with their peers, the mother had filed that restraining order at some point in the past. And we found the effects very drastically between these two groups. the students who were unreported domestic violence were causing all the negative spillovers, where those students who had previously been reported were no longer causing negative spillovers on their classmates. And we took this as very encouraging, because once the mother filed the restraining order, that child was no longer a bad apple, so to speak.
Yeah, and this is a question you always hate to ask researchers, but I'll ask anyways. Have you had an opportunity to share these findings? Have there been any response from the agencies that provided the data?
Alachua County, Florida has been really helpful. They're in fact working with us right now to match these records to long-term college records in the state of Florida, wage outcomes as the children age. I think as a researcher, it takes time to actually have policy implemented into practice. But in the case of Alachua County, they have a long history of working with researchers, David Figlio, myself, Mark, and have been very amenable to working with us on this research project.